Okay, good morning. My name is Ashley Methot, and I am the event coordinator with the New Hampshire Municipal Association. Thank you for joining us for the Recycling 101 Municipal Solid Waste and Recycling in New Hampshire. Today we have with us Reagan Bissonnette, Executive Director with the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, and Heather Herring, Member Services Representative, Northeast Resource Recovery Association. Thank you both for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Ashley.
Couple housekeeping reminders for the attendees. We do ask that you stay muted during the presentation. If you want to ask questions, we do ask that you either submit the questions in the chat box or you raise your hand and we will ask you to unmute and begin talking. To submit a question in the chat box, please click on the little chat bubble. Most of these icons that I'm about to tell you about can be found at the bottom of your screen. At least for me, that's where they are. However, depending on what sort of computer or tablet you're on, they could be up at the top or they could be over on the left or the right. You just want to scroll with your little mouse and you should be able to find them. The other option that you can use to chat is to raise your hand. And to do that, you're going to click on the little reactions tab down at the bottom or left-hand side top. But the little reactions tab is the smiley face with the plus sign. And we hope you enjoy today. And with that said, I'd like to turn the program over to Reagan and Heather.
Great. Thanks very much. And it's good to be here today. Happy Earth Day, everyone. I'm Reagan Bissonnette, and I'm glad to be joined here by Heather Herring, and we are with the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. And if there's something that we really enjoy talking about, it's recycling and trash, and Earth Day is a great day to talk about it. So thanks for joining us. I do want to acknowledge that it has been quite a year for everybody, and we in particular are very grateful for all the work of our solid waste operators and all of those of you who work in public works, because it's been a real transition. But one of the benefits of the pandemic is it's a little easier for us all to get together to do presentations like this. So we're glad to be here today. So here is an agenda of what we are going to cover. We are going to tell you a little bit about the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, and then we'll provide an introduction to recycling. Then we will delve into recycling markets, and we're going to close the first part of our presentation with some case studies, talking specifically about glass recycling and plastic recycling. And then we'll pause for a break, about a 15-minute break. And then we'll move on and talk about composting, especially composting food scraps. We'll talk about pay-as-you-throw, and then we'll wrap up talking about full cost accounting. And we will make sure that we pause for questions after each section. And we'll also have some time for Q&A at the very end. And we did receive a few questions in advance that were submitted. And we're going to answer some of those throughout the presentation, and others we can cover during one of the question and answer breaks. So to tell you a little bit about the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, we were founded 40 years ago, and we are a recycling nonprofit that helps communities manage their own recycling programs. And our members are primarily municipalities throughout New England, with the majority of our members in New Hampshire and Vermont. And in particular, over 80% of the municipalities in New Hampshire are members of NRRA. And there's two major aspects to our work. One of the things we do is that we operate a cooperative marketing and purchasing model. And what we do is we connect municipalities selling their recyclables directly to the companies that wish to acquire them. And in 2020, we returned over $1.8 million to our members from the revenue from the sale of their recyclables. And this is pretty unusual because we're one of only a handful of nonprofits in the country that operates a model like this. Typically, this is handled by for-profit companies like Casella and Waste Management. And just to give you a sense of what we handle for recycling, just about everything. So we help communities with their glass, with their paper, cardboard, electronics. containers like plastic and aluminum cans, scrap metal. So we handle just about everything. And then because we're a nonprofit, the other major aspect of our work is education and technical assistance. We hold regular monthly meetings for solid waste operators. We typically have regular facility tours in non-pandemic times. And we also hold an annual conference each year. And this year we're going to do that virtually, but typically it's a 2-day in-person conference that we hold. And then we also have programs to help schools with their recycling. And now that we've told you all a little bit about us, we thought it'd be helpful to learn a little bit about who is in the audience today. And so we're going to have a few other polls throughout the workshop, but here's the first one. And we'd love to have everyone let us know, what is the size of your community? You know, and if you have a big seasonal change, why don't you go ahead and give us your non-peak population, but we'll go ahead and open up a poll so that you all can give us a sense of who's here and we all have a sense of who's in the audience, since we can't do more of a, you know, raise your hand type of thing like we might do in person. So we'll give it just another moment. It looks like almost everyone has responded. All right, and can everybody see those results? This is really interesting. We actually have right about split in quarters. So we run the gamut. We've got some small communities here under 2,500 people, all the way up to over 10,000. So that's really interesting. Usually it's skewed a bit one way or the other, but this gives us a nice sense of where people are at. So thanks for sharing that. All right, let's move on. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Heather here to talk about an introduction to recycling and some foundational principles that will be useful as we get into more depth about recycling.
Thank you, Reagan. You know, the real question is why recycle? We want to, go for some of the basics. So next slide, please. So you can see by this graph from 2018 from the EPA, the total municipal solid waste generated by material as a total of 292 million tons. This is, to understand recycling, we first need to understand trash. The municipal solid waste, waste generated by households excludes commercial and industrial waste, construction and demolition waste. But you can see that the leading content is paper and paperboard at 23%, followed by food and plastics and many other materials. This is the kind of national context. These EPA numbers are from 2018. The figures are listed by weight. And really the takeaway of this graph is to show that approximately half of all of the MSW in theory is recyclable, and that a third of it is compostable. So we can definitely make advances on how to take the weight out of our waste. So NRRA deals with the different New Hampshire waste reduction hierarchy. So what really gets talked about commonly are the the bottom of three in orange and red, are the waste to energy, incineration, and landfilling. So when we think about trash and waste, we think about landfilling first. But really what NRRA deals with are the top three, are the source reduction, recycling and reuse, and composting. So we're only recycling about a third of the MSW that's generated, about 32.1% in 2018 per the EPA. And we really, need to focus on the top three that are a larger portion of that upside down triangle. Moving on to the total MSW landfill by material in 2018, had 146 million tons. This is, for the entire country. So this, it's similar idea for New Hampshire, but we don't have recent studies in New Hampshire like this, like other neighboring have. Landfilling a lot of recyclables and food waste is the largest component of landfilled items. And we'll discuss food scraps and food waste more later. Okay, let's talk about the disposal of solid waste in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has 6 landfills and 1 incinerator. Of the 6 landfills, there are 3 unlimited service areas, Mount Carberry in Success, North Country Environmental Services in Bethlehem, and Waste Management Turnkey in Rochester. And then there are 3 limited service area in Conway, Lebanon, and Nashua. Also, there's the Wheelabrator incinerator in Concord, and recently proposed landfill by Casella in Belton, New Hampshire. But the biggest thing that I came when really focusing in on New Hampshire waste, New Hampshire landfills, is that 50% of the material that is disposed of in New Hampshire landfills comes from out of state, and most of that is from Massachusetts. So that's surprising to most residents. They don't recognize that detail. So when does recycling happen? I live in Keene, and we have a dual stream system, and I'm so excited. I put my bins out for the truck to pick it up, and most people think about, when does recycling happen? And I put my glass bottles and tin cans into the container and put it at the curb, and don't I feel good on Earth Day that I've done some recycling? But not really. Recycling doesn't happen when you put it in a bin or a curb or take it to the transfer station. Recycling only happens when we take the materials and make them into new products that people use. So it's great to feel like you're diverting material, but until those bales or those gaylords, that material, that loose material, goes to a mill, goes to a facility, and is made into new products, recycling that loop doesn't close until then. So what are those types of materials? Well, the first major component of residential recycling are fibers. And I see some magazines, but mostly I see paperboard, mixed paper, and your junk mail, your cardboard, that's turned into paper backing on roofing shingles, paper towel rolls, and new paperboard packaging. So that's the biggest container. Next, we have cardboard that's turned into paper bags, new cardboard, the cardboard medium, which is the corrugated middle part, that wavy part in the middle. And then notebooks and computer paper. Some towns have specific, white paper that is turned into paper towels, your toilet, facial tissue, toilet paper, napkins, and new computer paper. Containers are the second major component of residential recycling, and steel and tin cans get made into new cans and appliances, etc. And aluminum cans are made directly into new aluminum cans. That's the shortest cycle, the easiest, same into same. And then moving on, we will cover these end markets both in more detail in our case studies with glass bottles and plastics. And I'll cover that more later. So what are the primary types of recycling in New Hampshire? The first one is source separated recycling. It's what my colleague Bonnie and I call, just the, hand sorted New England, material. And that is where the residents do all the work. They separate out the recyclables individually at their local transfer station. They're bringing their steel cans and putting it to one bin. They're putting their glass bottles into another bin. They're putting their cardboard separated out from their other paper into another bin. And dual stream recycling is like in my city. This is where in Keene, the fibers are separated from the containers. So I have 2 bins, one for fibers, one for containers. And then as you can see here on the line at the municipal recycling facility, they separate those out into 2 major areas. And then we have single stream recycling. And that's needing an expensive materials recovery facility and staff to sort out recyclables into their individual commodities for sale. MRFs also do dual stream as well. We call them MRFs, MRF for short. But containers and fibers all mixed together, and what Bonnie says is it's a higher cost to unscramble the egg. It's easiest for the residents to just put it all in one bin, but then you have to take the time and money to separate all those materials. And there's typically a lower value in commodities because there's more likely to have contamination. If you look at a bale that's created from single stream recycling and a bale of beautiful aluminum cans, it's a sight to see that, just really pure material, that's just going to have higher value in the market. They both have value, but the source separated is going to have a higher value. It just takes more labor to get it to that way. All right, so the common recyclables and contaminants are listed here. So we are going to talk about metal, plastic, glass, and paper, and focus on those for today. Not as much other items like electronics, your scrap metal, propane tanks, but we will briefly discuss batteries because batteries are such a hot topic. I go to any facility and it's on their mind. Batteries are on their mind. So just a little bit about battery recycling. Lithium-ion batteries, as you know, are increasingly causing fires at recycling facilities. And that's everything from my mother sending me a singing Valentine card that has the little battery in it. She pays $5 for that, doesn't realize that it's a 1 week to admire it. And then it goes, if it's thrown into the MSW and that battery is not removed, it's fine as is. But if then a loader, crushes it as it's, moving the material, that could spark a fire. And so, many towns have had fires, some reported, some not reported. And it's a big concern for operators because the batteries are in just more and more things. Some items you're not able to remove it. Residents don't understand that it's a danger. And we want to continue the education to offer residents a safe drop-off facilities through Call to Recycle. So you can get a box that is fire safe and directions on how to do that, because that is an up and coming concern for sure, a safety concern. All right, at this time, I'd like to take a poll of what type of recycling system you have in your town. Do you have single stream, all in one bin, dual stream, 2 different bins, or source separated? And we'll just give a minute for folks to do that poll. And I'm curious myself, what the percentages are represented today. And I think, that may correlate both with the size of your community, what you're able to educate residents to do, not to do, versus, just what the town is working towards. So at this point, we'll keep it open for just a little longer, but most people have answered. And it looks like we're pretty much right down the line between source separated and single stream, kind of half and half, 54%. So a little more single stream wins the day at 42% source separated, and just one person at the dual stream in a dual stream community. All right, well, that's good to know. All right, thank you so much. All right, so why recycle and why reduce waste? We received a question before that we'll get over that, but some of the details, it's to conserve financial resources. The highest cost for disposing of solid waste in the Northeast, it averaged about $85 per ton. Other parts of the country have half that or less. So we are really in an expensive part of the country as far as that goes. And this will only get more expensive The tipping fees will only increase. So recycling and other diversion methods are more financially attractive over time as markets recover. If we give this presentation a year ago, we've just seen great changes. Since China soared and since the pandemic, we've just seen a lot of variety. But over time, but for the long haul, and that's really what town administrators ask us, are like, what's the advantage on the long? We want to look at our 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plan, not just what's happening this month or this year. Sometimes that it's not quite the same with single stream or dual stream, but when markets are down, but as tipping fees and contracts come up, those tipping fees are going to surprise a lot of people. So recycling is worth it financially. It also conserves natural resources. There's that whole Earth Day contingency part of things, which is, waste diversion saves energy and natural resources. It saves valuable landfill capacity for waste that cannot be diverted. I'm sure you've already, heard that we have capacity issues here in New Hampshire and in our surrounding states. And, where is that material going to go? There's only so much space left in landfills. How can we send less to the landfills? So there's a saving that. And aluminum cans are a great example of that. It can come down to money. Recycling aluminum cans saves more than 90% of the energy needed to create a new aluminum can. And it's cheaper to recycle than to extract more, from the land. And nearly 75% of all aluminum produced is still in use today. So it's kind of our, aluminum cans, kind of the environmental symbol for recycling is that's just, direct to the same product and using less resources. All right, at this time, I'd like to take a short break for questions about the introduction. And I'd like to start that off with a question we had come in before the presentation, which was, why recycle? It's all going to the same place. I hear it's all going to the ocean. Why bother? Why do this? Well, we can speak for our members, and we can speak for what a member representative move every day. And we have moved in 2020 alone. NRRA has marketed over 50,000 tons of material to locations, mostly in the US, with a very small percentage of that going to Canada and to overseas. So mostly it's domestic, and it's a lot of material that we have personally moved, so we can speak to that. We can speak to the fact that the companies that, the vendors that we use have been vetted before we use them. And, we research them to bring out the best service and cost to our members. And at this, for an example, right now, folks are getting over $100 per ton for cardboard, for example. And so we know that the mill wants that material, and that material is needed for an end product. So it's really it's the lower the supply, the higher the demand. And right now, cardboard is in high demand. It's very hot. Of course, we have a lot of material being delivered to our doorsteps, and a lot of, the higher quality of that cardboard, the higher the value. So our vendors know and respect the quality of the material. We have to send pictures of that material to prove what's in the bale. So the vendors trust what's in our members' material and can get that the highest price. And the quality of our buyers, and they know that they're doing the right thing. They're making it into new products. So we can speak for the material we're moving. And so that's why we feel it's worth it. We can see the close of the loop, our conference coming up about recycling with results. We're seeing those results. We're taking truckloads of material and moving it into making into new products. So other questions, what else? Let's see. Could we have contact information for the facilities from the disposal of solid waste in New Hampshire slide provided to us? Sure, we could provide that to you after the presentation, certainly. Any other questions at this time? Feel free to put it in the chat.
Yes, Heather. So I received a message directly to me. So I'll read it out loud, but I just wanted to let everybody know really quick that maybe I didn't explain the chat well enough. Make sure that when you put a question in that you just under the word to, there's a little drop down menu. If you just click send to everyone, that way all the presenters can see it. Everyone can see it. I know that you may want to stay anonymous, and if you do, then yes, you can send them to me directly, and I can share them with the presenters during question time. But otherwise, if not, please just direct your messages to everyone, unless of course you have a message directly for NHMA, then you can share them with me. But so the question is, how is the weight of food measured when it is mixed with trash?
Well, I can speak for the kind of the education piece of NRRA, and that we have a waste audit basically that we do called a TOLD, a trash on the lawn day, that we do in schools. So when we go into a school, before pre-pandemic, go into a school, you lay out a tarp on the ground, and you can take a day, they can save a day or a week's worth of the trash that they generate in their cafeteria, their offices, their classrooms, etc. And they can dump it out, put gloves on, and sort through that material. We actually sort it into a commodity, a food waste, etc., and then weigh that material at the end. So we have a total weight, and then we have it by part. So you can conduct that, at a municipal solid waste facility as well, basically doing a waste audit to find averages. And the EPA has done that as well. So through waste audits. And I see another question, is there an optimal level of sorting? That's a very good question. The surprising thing when I first started working at NRA is to see, two small towns next to each other, and to see one town, everybody has their own recipe. Everybody has their own particular needs and what they feel that they can work with their residents to do, because, I know change is hard, but what, they might be separating their white paper out because that has a high value at this point. And other towns don't, they put that in their mixed paper. So everybody side by side can have different decisions they make, and then they're going to different vendors, they're getting different prices for that. So you may have a town 10 miles apart doing different things, but it's really the decision on what the town. So is there an optimal level? I think Bonnie and Michelle and I would probably agree that the highest value you're going to get in market is the more separations, the more you separate your materials. Now, on the other side of that, you have the labor of that, and whether you train your residents to do most of that labor in source separating, where they're taking the material to a bin, they're doing the separating, or if you have a two-stage separation where the resident puts it down on a table, and then the staff go through things and make sure there's no contamination before they put it in the bin. So it's all over. It's on staffing levels, it's on education to residents. But the more you separate things out, the higher the value of the material. Any other questions? Okay. Does the market reward a certain level of sorting? I think I kind of covered that, is that the more you separate your material, like some communities think about non-ferrous, really separating out that material, you can get great value for that. But it takes time. So it's just what your balance is there. Reagan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say that's actually a great segue into talking a bit more depth into recycling markets. And we will be talking quite a bit more about the different level of sorting that different communities might want to do. And as Heather said, it really does have so many different factors, but we're going to try and tease apart a bit more of that as we go. So, as we've been talking about, recyclables are commodities. And one thing about commodities is that the recycling markets, they change regularly. They change like the stock market. So every time we give a presentation like this, the snapshot of what value municipalities are getting for different materials changes every single time. And I will actually be giving you all a snapshot of that later. But what's really helpful to understand about recycling markets today, we have to start with China's national sword, which was a really important policy that was placed a few years ago. And then we can talk a bit about what COVID has done with recycling markets to get us to where, what the value is of recyclables today. So first, starting with China's national sword, this was a policy that the country of China put into place back effective January of 2018. And pre-pandemic, this is all we talked about in recycling when it came to recycling markets, but then the pandemic changed things up as well. But what China's national sword did is it banned all plastics, all unsorted mixed paper. So if you've got all your papers mixed together, like your junk mail and your magazines and your newspaper, China doesn't want that all mixed together. And then also textiles like clothing. It also had some impact on glass and metals, but less so. And we started to feel the effects of this in late 2017 when the ban was announced. And it had a really dramatic impact on the value of recyclable material worldwide and in the United States and in New England. Because at the time, China was one of the world's largest purchasers of recyclable material before this ban was put into place. And so, of course, when demand drops, but supply continues in any marketplace, that means the price is going to drop. Now, why did China implement this ban? One of the main reasons why China implemented this ban is because China was importing large amounts of single stream material. Material that was coming out of, I should say, coming out of single stream facilities. So coming out of materials recovery facilities. And as Heather mentioned earlier, when you're using a single stream system and you have all of your material mixed together, even with manual labor and materials recovery facilities, you still can't unscramble that egg, as we would say. It's still difficult to end up with as high a value of the end product as you would if you were having material come from a source separated community, for example. And so what happened was China would be importing, say, mixed paper. So as I said, all those different types of fibers mixed together. And there would be other things in it that they didn't want. There would be plastic, like bits of plastic bags that had made it through. Other types of contaminants. There might have been some broken paper that made, or excuse me, broken glass that made it into there. And so these were things that, they as a country had to dispose of. And this actually led to some pretty severe environmental problems in the country because they lacked the sufficient infrastructure to handle all of that waste that they were importing in, along with the recyclable commodities that they did want to import. And to talk about this in a bit more depth, I think it's really helpful to understand sort of the average composition of residential material coming out of a residential recycling stream. So this is showing us when we're looking at a single stream model, this gives us a sense of what the impacts were from China's ban. So as Heather mentioned earlier, fiber is the largest component by weight of pretty much all residential recycling programs. And so what we're looking at is a pie chart that shows us coming out of one of those single stream materials recovery facilities, those facilities that actually separate out your single stream and sometimes dual stream recycling. Here is the average of what was coming out of those facilities based on a report that the Northeast Recycling Council did in August of 2020. And they surveyed different materials recovery facilities and asked them what types of materials were coming out of their streams. And here's what they found. They were told that roughly 56% of the material leaving those facilities was fibers, so cardboard, paper. I will say that for many communities, that might be even higher, up to maybe 65% of the composition of your recycling stream. They had about 14% of the material coming out was glass. And as a reminder, this is all by weight. We do everything by weight in the recycling and trash world. And then the next one is, I think, really notable. So the next largest item coming out by weight from these facilities is what they call residue. And when they talk about residue, they're talking about two things. They're talking about, one, actual trash, things that they don't want, that they cannot recycle, that has to be thrown away, or recyclables that for whatever reason the facility wasn't able to properly recover. So these facilities aren't perfect. So sometimes you're going to have things that could and should be recycled, for whatever reason not get picked up by the equipment, and they'll end up in the residue. So the problem is these facilities end up having to dispose of that residue. Next, in terms of weight, is plastic. There's quite a bit of plastic material out there, but of course it's lightweight. And then last is metal. And so seeing what a big component fibers is, and that China was one of the largest purchasers of recyclable material, it may not be surprising that fibers were really the item that were hardest hit from China's national sword. And that's because, in particular, before the China's national sword policy, China purchased 55% of the world's scrap paper. That is an astonishing number. So when the single biggest purchaser of this material suddenly stops buying it, that had a dramatic impact on recycling markets, particularly because fibers is such a large component of recycling markets. So for example, this gives you a snapshot of what happened to the trading price of mixed paper from October 2016, back when it was still trading, all the way up to a high of $85 a ton. And then you can see the dramatic drop after China's national sword policy was implemented. And back right before the pandemic before the pandemic hit us, you can see that we actually were at points where mixed paper had a value of essentially zero. Now, fortunately, this has gotten better in the last year or so, in part due to COVID, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. Now, the silver lining from this dramatic upheaval of recycling markets following China's ban is that we actually have seen domestic investment in paper mills. So it used to be that we had more paper mills here in the United States where communities could be sending their recyclable material to get made into new products. But as China was purchasing more and more recyclables, a lot of this material was ultimately getting exported overseas. So now we see that it doesn't look like China is going to change its policy. There's no expectation that China is suddenly going to turn around and start acquiring more recyclable material. So that has given a number of companies confidence that they can start making investments in the United States to begin recycling this material here. So what we've seen, and this is again a report by the Northeast Recycling Council, they have been tracking announcements for either brand new mills or existing mills that are going to increase their capacity to use recycled fibers, mostly cardboard, but also some mixed paper. And so this is good news. And we expect that as these facilities come online, it's possible some of them won't, but if the majority of these facilities come online, it actually is going to help us take up the excess glut of material that we currently have in the United States and help improve the price of mixed paper, and also, reduce the distance that we're having to send this material, which is great. I will say that the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, we were exporting very little material even before China's ban. So fortunately, we were a bit less impacted in terms of where we were sending material for our municipal members. But at the same time, we still ran into the situation where all municipalities are getting, we're getting lower prices for material following China's national sword. So everyone was impacted to some degree. Now, I think it's helpful to take a look at some national trends over the last decade for materials recovery facilities, those single and dual stream recycling facilities. because this can be helpful for understanding the resulting impacts on single and dual stream communities after China's national sort policy was implemented. So what this chart shows, the squiggly line that jumps all over, that's the the actual average value of a ton of material that was being sold from these facilities. So you can see it kind of jumped all over the place, but it's had a steady decline down over the past 10 years. And this took us up until, I think, 2019. And then the green line that's sort of steadily going up is giving you a sense of what are the processing costs of these large facilities. And what you can see is that over time, the cost of operating these facilities that separate our recycling have gone up over time. And that means, and you can see that at a point, the revenue that was being received from selling the recyclables actually dropped below the cost of operating these facilities. And this is where we start to see some major impacts on the value of recyclables in recent years. Now, why is it that these changes were happening? So here's a snapshot. And what we see is, we talked about residue, the material that has to be disposed of coming out of these facilities. They're seeing more and more residue coming out of these facilities right now, which increases their cost of disposal. Now, why is that? Part of it is what we call wish cycling. And this is this phenomena where people want to do the right thing. They want to recycle, and they want to recycle so much that they'll put things in their recycling that don't belong there. And so that ends up ultimately having to be disposed of. And then there are other things like, tighter standards. As I mentioned, with China's national sword, what they would still accept after the ban had stricter standards. And so that meant that there was more residue that was having to be disposed of from these facilities. They also ran into the situation where just their operation and maintenance went up. They needed more machinery, more sophisticated machinery in order to meet these new limits that China imposed that sort of affected the entire market. They also, in many cases, were slowing down their lines where they had people physically sorting material so that they could have more time to meet higher standards and remove more contamination. And then in addition, they also had their fixed costs were increasing. These facilities tend to be getting larger. They need fancier technology. I can tell you that some of these facilities are investing in extremely expensive, sophisticated technology so that they can generate a higher quality product in the end. Now, let's get us to more recently, in the last year. What have we seen happening from the pandemic? Well, the biggest thing that we have seen during the pandemic was a very dramatic increase in the amount of material coming into our municipal recycling systems. And so we've seen both recycling go up, we've seen trash tonnage go up. We've also seen construction and demolition debris coming to municipalities go up. And I imagine that many of you may already be aware of this because it just has been quite dramatic. And there's various reasons for this, but certainly one was that with businesses shut down and with schools shut down, especially in the beginning, people are at home more. And so they're just generating more waste at home. And so waste that may have gone to commercial waste or schools is now getting diverted to municipal waste. And so it was not uncommon for us to hear from municipalities that they have seen a 30% increase in material coming to their facilities over the past year. Now, in the early days of the pandemic, it was very interesting to see what happened with the recycling market. We actually found that the price, the value of fibers, mixed paper and cardboard in particular, increased in April and May of last year. And then it dropped in June. And it was really interesting to find out why that was. And it was because when businesses shut down, businesses are a very steady supply of quality cardboard. Because many businesses, maybe that's kind of all they're sending out. Think grocery stores, they have lots of cardboard boxes coming through. And so when those businesses shut down, some of them completely, all of a sudden the value of fibers had to go up because there was just less supply and there was still demand. Companies still needed that material to make new products. And then finally, when the price rose enough, any excess material that anyone had been holding on to, hoping the price would increase, they put it out on the market. And so the market adjusted. And so now what we have seen is that cardboard revenue has stayed steadier over the last few months. Mills are needing cardboard and other types of paper in order to make all those Amazon boxes. And all of those things are in very high demand. And so our mills in the United States that we send material to, they've remained open through the pandemic, and really it's been sort of business as usual for them. They've had quite a bit to do. And I would say that overall, we are definitely seeing an increased value compared to a year ago for the value of fibers. And again, as I mentioned, it really is due to that decreased supply that we're still seeing a decreased supply from businesses and schools. Now, when we look at plastic, the value of our #1 plastic bottles, our PET bottles, these are sort of your clear water bottles, for example. We've seen the pricing go down from a year ago. And that is in part because during the pandemic, and especially earlier in the pandemic, we have seen both apparel and carpet manufacturing go down because people were buying less. And that is a really huge end market for this type of plastic, is to make either your fleece jacket or to make carpets. And then we also saw, with people being at home, there was an increase in the use of single-use plastics like these soda bottles and water bottles. And so we actually had an increased supply. The other thing that is always impacting the value of plastics is the cost of oil. And the cost of oil has been relatively low. And so what that means is it's often less expensive to make new plastic out of virgin material versus making new plastic out of recycled material. Another impact we've seen during the current pandemic is on aluminum. And this is kind of interesting. We have had a can shortage. And this was because can manufacturers had their operations disrupted earlier in the pandemic. And yet there were more and more people who were drinking at home. In particular, remember when bars and restaurants were closed, people were having more beverages at home. And so they needed, they were drinking more beer, more cans of beer. And also a lot of beer manufacturers realized that their keg business had disappeared overnight and they needed to be sending out more in cans. So we ended up having this can shortage. There has been some increase in revenue for aluminum cans over, say, a year ago, but not as much as we would have liked, because the can shortage was more on the manufacturing side, not so much on the supply side. There's been plenty of supply of aluminum cans. So looking at all of this in terms of what's happened with the markets in recent years, now let's talk a bit about what we're seeing as the impact on municipalities as a result of these recycling markets. So first, starting with our single and dual stream communities. We've definitely seen that these communities are experiencing higher tipping fees for their recycling than before China's national soared. Although certainly we've seen some improvement in recent months. And for example, I live in Concord, New Hampshire, and Concord had worked out a great deal years ago where Casella will pick up the trash and recycling, and the recyclables are picked up at no charge, because there was this assumption that you could sell the recyclables always for enough revenue to offset the cost of processing that material. Now what we're seeing is that as communities are renegotiating their recycling contracts, if they're doing single and dual stream, they're seeing really increased costs for recycling, because as I showed earlier, since the cost of managing these facilities has gone up over time, and when the value of the recyclables coming out of these facilities is down, as it is in lower markets, then someone needs to cover that difference in cost. And so that cost is being put on municipalities. We're also seeing additional fees being worked into contracts if contamination limits are exceeded. So, for example, a contract might indicate that the vendor is going to do a waste audit occasionally, and they're going to sample the material, and they're going to see how much of it is that residue trash that they don't want. And if there is too much residue coming into the facility from a certain community, they have the right through these contract terms to actually charge additional fees on the municipality. And so that really provides an incentive for communities to educate their residents and clean up their streams. We have also seen some communities switching back to source separation because of these higher costs. And so, for example, here in New Hampshire, we've seen Rollinsford, Andover, and Guilford all make the switch in recent years. They previously were doing single or dual stream recycling, and now they've switched back to source separation. And so we did have one question that was submitted beforehand that asked if municipalities should explore sorted recycling if feasible rather than single stream, and are there advantages for doing so? And the answer is that for some communities it does make sense. So in some cases in recent years, the value of recyclables that you can get from source separated systems has been higher than, or I should say the revenue has been much better than the cost of paying for single or dual stream recycling. There was a time when, cardboard revenue was $100 a ton, whereas the cost of single stream recycling to a community was $120 a ton. That value, that cost of single and dual stream recycling has improved a bit in recent months, just as the overall recycling market improves. But that has certainly been a major factor for several communities to make that switch. And in general, as we've said, the more you separate, the higher the value of the commodities that your community can sell. I mean, basically, with a materials recovery facility with single or dual stream recycling, while it's easier for residents, you're sort of outsourcing that cost of sorting to a facility. With source separated, you're having your residents do it for you, and they can do a better job than a large facility can do. And then we did see, because of all of this, we did see some communities burning or landfilling recyclables, like burning paper, for example, or landfilling. But that's generally been a temporary measure, and not as many communities as the news might have you think. And so then also, in terms of the impact on source separated communities, we have seen less of a dramatic impact on source separated communities from China's national sword. As I said, because there's usually a higher quality of commodities coming out of these systems, and they're not dependent on expensive materials recovery facilities. But at the same time, everyone has been impacted by these lower prices. So this is a good time to pause for questions before we move into some of our case studies. And I do see that someone had submitted in the chat saying that in the past, I think China hadn't developed their own fiber sources, which is why they were dependent on recycled paper, but now they have their own sources. Yes, that is also a piece of the story. So it is true that part of the reason why China was importing so much fiber was that the country didn't have their own good systems for recovering their own paper that they were creating and then developing new paper in the country. They have been working on improving their basically recycling collection methods so that they could use their own products. Now, the other piece is when this ban was announced, there were quite a number of mills in China who were very concerned about this ban because they knew that when the ban was announced, there still wasn't a sufficient supply of mixed paper and cardboard being collected in China to supply what those mills needed. And so we saw things like a Chinese company that actually bought a mill in Maine and started generating paper pulp in Maine because they found that they could create paper pulp, and then they were allowed to import the paper pulp into China, even though they couldn't import the actual mixed paper. So there was definitely a bit of a sort of some growing pains for mills in China during this time. So are there any other questions at this time before we move on to talking a bit more about glass recycling? Okay, well, then I will turn it over to Heather to talk a bit about glass recycling, because it's something we haven't really delved into yet.
Okay, yes. It turns out that glass markets really weren't affected by China's national sword or really COVID. So let's talk a little more about glass recycling. There are limited markets in the Northeast. The bottle-to-bottle recycling is ideal, just like the aluminum can to aluminum can cycle, but it is a challenge because we don't have those local markets. And fiberglass and aggregate are more common results for glass recycling today. So what are some of the solutions for municipalities to recycle glass? Because it's heavy, right? That's the first thing people realize, since our waste is measured by weight and glass is very heavy. What can you do to get the weight out of my waste? So it's expensive to transport. And right now, transportation costs are high. And the last bottling plant that was local in Massachusetts, the Ardagh bottling plant, closed in 2018, right around China's sword, that particular year. And it often has contaminants in the glass, like Pyrex. It looks the same, but it's of a different consistency and would be considered a contaminant in just glass. Ceramics as well are detrimental when you create new glass or fiberglass. For example, in the fiberglass process, there are all these spindles. There are thousands of spindles. Think of like a cotton candy machine. You have all these spindles spinning the glass fibers. And if you have any contaminant within the glass that's received, you'll end up with a problem, and it'll shut down. It'll break one of those spindles, and they're very expensive to replace. So the purity of what the material is, whatever the commodity, is very important, especially in glass. And broken glass can create wear and tear on equipment. So what do you do with your heavy glass? Well, if you have the benefits of removing glass from a single or dual stream, if you're allowed by the vendor, the example is a dual stream commingled containers without the glass costs $5 less per ton than the commingled containers with glass. So it's an incentive to remove that glass from the material. So what do you do with the glass instead? And you'll notice in these piles, back in the day, we used to separate by color of glass. And now that is not something that residents need to do today. So glass recycling, for example, in Keene and Lebanon, New Hampshire, their new NRRA host sites. And Stratford, Vermont saves money by sending their glass to Lebanon at $40 per ton instead of paying $121 per ton in their dual stream recycling. So taking that weight out of their waste, they have a much lower cost at removing of the glass from their system. But what you have to remember about glass recycling is it's glass bottles and jars only. and that Canadian vendor that we send it to cleans the glass and crushes it and makes it into fiberglass insulation, which is then sent back to the US. And 40 communities in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts participate in that program. And some communities also save money on single or dual stream costs by removing the glass, and they're starting to send more, starting to send some glass to be made into new bottles and jars, which is ideal. We would love that to happen for all the glass. That would be the shortest solution. But for now, we have this, program that goes, from New Hampshire. It's at most, 4-ish hours into Canada, and then sent back to the US as a US product. So we appreciate that program very much. The other program we have for glass is processed glass aggregate. We call that PGA for short. And that is glass bottles and jars, but that can include the Pyrex, the ceramics, the porcelain toilet, the window glass. And all that material is crushed into an aggregate. There are different widths of material depending on the state, but that material is used as a sub base for road and infrastructure projects like drainage, for drainage pipe, etc. And over 60 communities in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts participate in that program. For example, New London and Littleton are host sites for PGA, and the Waste Management Tree in Rochester is also a host site. And then between these programs, the glass program and the PGA program, we serve over 500,000 residents with glass recycling. So this has been a huge problem that NRRA has been instrumental in helping to solve, or pulling that weight out of the waste. Here's an example of a low-tech glass education from one of our members here at Hollis. She just wanted to make, when residents say, what happens to my glass? Where does it go? Where's my recycling go? Everybody gets those questions. She just made a little poster, put it up on a board there to show people, in pictures, and just to show that it's, heading to a particular host site, heading to a particular vendor, made into new materials. And this is really key. Visuals are wonderful at recycling centers. We get a lot of questions from our members, and they say, well, here's my setup, but how do I show it? And anytime you hang up a container to see what is allowed or what is not allowed, or answer questions through your commonly asked questions, putting up a visual for that is a great way, and will help educate folks. So that's awesome. We also have kind of the high-tech version of glass education. We decided to make a glass story map and video called Through the Looking Glass. So this was made last year. Transparent look at glass recycling in New England. And that is found on our website in our resource library. You'll see a glass story map section right there on the website, and feel free to go through it. And really, it walks you through visually with maps showing the different host sites. And Reagan's pulled that up right now, so you can kind of scroll through that to describe, what's the problem, what's the solution, and then eventually it's loading a little slower here, but it'll show you the host sites color coordinated, showing you the communities in blue and green for our two different programs for glass and PGA, with the host sites in circles. And as you scroll through, so it's just a really great visual reminder. So whether you have a computer or a poster board, your community can show what we're doing with glass and the different options. So it's really, I recommend you go, spend 10 minutes and scroll through that, and be great at, town meetings, et cetera, as a visual to persuade your communities and residents on what to do with your glass. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Reagan to talk more about plastics.
Oh, I see we didn't put in a little pause for questions, but it might be good to pause here if people have questions about glass before we jump into plastics.
Yes, that makes sense. And I see we've received some things in. Seems like corporations and manufacturers package products in a manner that suits them best from a profit perspective. Think Amazon envelopes and boxes, which then passes the cost and responsibility of recycling and disposal to local government. Does NRRA have any thoughts on what can be done at the state or federal level to ensure that companies have some skin in the game with regard to reducing packaging, ensuring packaging is recyclable, and covering the cost of the life cycle of materials? Well, extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is something that we'll cover a little bit in this, but yes, that has come up in conversation that, yes, as a community, when you get to the recycling station, you're stuck with the material. What do I do with it? Does it go into recycling? Is it recyclable? Does it go into trash? How do we make this packaging, this material, of a singular nature so that it can be separated and recycled? And it's really talking about that producer responsibility. I think we've had consumer guilt long enough, and we definitely have responsibilities, but some of it comes with what are our choices in the supermarket, what are our choices in the store, and how to give us more easier choices to recycle. So that is, yes, we have some resources on our website on EPR, and I believe Reagan, we're going to talk about it a little bit later in the presentation. So that is, going back to the businesses themselves is definitely something to follow up on. And to follow up on that, Reagan, did you want to insert something there?
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of extended producer responsibility, and yes, that is what a lot of people think is the solution here to that problem. New Hampshire is special, we're the live for your die state. So I will say that a number of our neighboring states, they have certain types of extended producer responsibility laws in place. So, for example, mattress recycling programs or paint recycling programs. And these are systems that shift to the producers of the material some of the cost of the end of life of those materials. We don't have any laws like that in New Hampshire. And I have to say, just, we as a state tend to be a little more circumspect of legislation like that, anything that could come off as a tax, for example. So while there have been discussions about passing extended producer responsibility in New Hampshire, we haven't really seen that come to pass yet. And I'm not aware of any current legislation that is proposing that type of extended producer responsibility. But yes, that would probably be a really meaningful way to help reduce some of the costs that are currently being felt by municipalities. And I'm sure there's some talk at the federal level, but largely this has been done at the state level so far. But we're just not seeing a lot of traction in New Hampshire at this time.
I see another question come in that doesn't have to do with glass specifically, but about storage. Does the revenue from a higher tonnage of recyclable materials increase if more of the same material is picked up from the community at the same time? Does it make sense to store large quantities? And the short answer to that is yes. We are moving tractor trailer loads full is the ideal. You get the highest price if you have a singular material at that tonnage. Yes, it still does occur if there's multiple materials on the truck, but best value at all times is single material. So we do move multiple materials at one time, but your best price, if you're just looking at price, your best price, and then also the cost of transportation is so high, you don't want a half-empty truck. You want to fill it up with something. So whether that's going to a mill and it's a singular material, it's all cardboard, or if that is going to one of our brokers that has multiple materials on it, you want that truck full. So whether you have a floor scale or not, what we do in member services is we're looking at your last 3 loads that you moved of that material. So we're looking at your average weight of your bale or average weight of your gaylord, etc. So even if you don't have an exact number to prove the weight, we take an average of the last 3 to get a better estimate of that if you don't have the exact weight. So yes, more storage is better. That is why communities are tending to invest, invest in containers, storage containers, because having that material covered in most cases is better and has higher value to the material than being out in the open air with the snow. That we had hail here yesterday. So with as long as it, in New England weather of all types, whether it's sun, rain, or snow, having storage containers better so that you can store up. And we have communities that move material weekly, monthly. We have communities that move once or twice a year of a commodity, but storing that up, yes, better price for that. Reagan, did you want to cover anything else? Or
well, I was going to say that's actually a really good segue into our case study on plastics recycling, because we're going to talk about some of those market considerations. So that, and it's a very important question because it's highly relevant to getting value from your recycling. So let's talk a bit about plastic recycling. It's a pretty hot topic, so we thought it might be one to go into in a bit more depth. We get a lot of questions from both our municipal members and also members of the public who are wanting to talk about plastic recycling. So let's start first with, how do we decide how to market material and which vendor to send it to? And of course, in this case, I'm really talking about source separated material, which can also include, if a single or dual stream community is separating out their glass. But largely what we're going to talk about here is a bit of the nuts and bolts about how a municipality with source separated recycling is actually going to market their material. But even if your community has dual or single stream recycling, this will probably give you a little bit better sense of the work that has to be done by the materials recovery facility in order to market your material. So it's still relevant. So we make a point to work only with reputable vendors who have environmentally sound practices, because that's an important part of our mission. So we have a number of vendors that we work with. We try to have multiple vendors available that we have relationships with for each commodity so that we can get the best price for our members. And so if a community comes to us and says that they are ready to move their load of cardboard, then we're going to usually reach out to several different companies to get the best quote for them. But of course, money isn't everything. As great as it is to get a high price, it's really important to have a company that provides good service. We want them to be responsive for logistics, scheduling, pickup, billing. All of those things can actually turn out to be quite more of a headache than I would have hoped before I joined this job. But it really is an important part of finding quality companies to work with. And transportation is a big piece. So sometimes our members are able to transport material themselves, to arrange transportation to send the material to one of our vendors. Sometimes our vendors are handling the transportation themselves. It's easier for us and our members when a company we work with wants to arrange transportation and send their own trucks. But increasingly, as we're finding that the trucking industry is getting more expensive with less drivers, more and more often we're having companies tell us that they would rather that we arrange the transportation, which has a whole other sort of logistical complication. And sometimes we are sending material direct to a mill. So for example, getting back to the question of how much material is ideal, if your community stores an entire tractor trailer load of cardboard, we might be able to send that cardboard directly to a mill in New England who is buying directly from us. Whereas if your community only has a few bales of material, compacted, compressed bales of cardboard, and then maybe they also have a few bales of plastic, we might be able to have a broker who will agree to take on one truck a few bales of cardboard, a few bales of plastic, and then maybe we'll do what we call a milk run, is we'll arrange to have a nearby community also add on a few of their bales. If we're sending that material mixed together to a broker, you're typically going to get a lower price for it. So if you can fill a whole truck, you tend to get better value for it. And then of course, there's also equipment that we have to take into account. So for communities, we need to know if they have balers and if they have a floor scale. So, as I mentioned before, a baler is basically a machine that compacts and compresses recyclable commodities into a really dense cube. And the value of that is that you really want to be able to fill a truck with as much weight as possible, because again, everything is done by weight in terms of costs and revenue in recycling and trash. So with a baler or multiple balers, a community is able to compress their material, and then we know we can get them a higher value for their material. Some communities have loose material. They might not have any balers on site, and so they might have what are called gaylords, just big sturdy cardboard boxes, and they fill that with loose material. And we also have markets for that, but because loose material, you can't fit as much on a truck, you're going to get a lower price for that. And then the floor scales come into account, where it's really helpful for municipality to know what is the weight of that bale. As Heather said, we'll look back and get a sense of what the average bale weights are, because we have some vendors, for example, we have a plastics vendor who had so many options for supply during the pandemic that they put in a minimum bale weight. And so they basically said that a community has to be able to fit 35,000 pounds of material onto a truck in order for them to accept it. Well, we had a lot of communities that we used to send their material to that vendor. Their bales weren't heavy enough. And so all of these factors come into play. And so a scale can help a community really know for sure what you have, because that helps the material get marketed better. And then, as we've mentioned, transportation is also a major factor. So most of the material that's getting moved throughout New England, especially New Hampshire and Vermont, is getting moved by truck. There are some places where rail is used, and increasingly as the cost of trucking transportation goes up, I know a number of vendors who, if they're looking to open a new facility, they want to be on rail because that can really lower costs. But of course, here in New Hampshire, we don't have that as an option. So everything is going by truck. Some items are later exported by container ship to overseas markets. Mixed paper, for example, is more likely to be exported, but by and large, as I mentioned, we do typically market all of our material throughout New England. There are very strong markets for just about everything domestically. And as I said, the shortage of truck drivers has just gotten worse over time. We've seen trucking prices increase quite noticeably just in the last few months as well, for a variety of factors. You might recall there was that big freeze in Texas. Well, apparently that had a major impact on the trucking market. Who would have thought? So that also factors in. You have to cover the cost of transportation when you're considering the revenue you're going to receive from material. Okay, so now that we've talked about these different marketing considerations, we can talk a bit more specifically about plastic as an example. So there are a dizzying amount of plastics. There's really 7, and I give examples here of what each type is. The ones that we have the most stable markets for, and that really nationwide, they're the most stable markets for, are the 1s, the 2s, and the 5s. So your number 1 plastics, again, are like your plastic water bottles. And the number 2 plastics, they're actually 2 totally separate markets, whether it is a colored plastic or it is a natural, I guess, opaque, translucent plastic. So like your milk jugs is what we would call a number 2 natural. And then your laundry detergent bottles, there's a great example of a number 2 HDPE colored. And then number 5 plastic is like your yogurt containers, polypropylene. That also has pretty steady markets throughout the United States. And then we'll talk a bit more about what happens with these different types of recyclables. But in terms of what things can be turned into, as I mentioned before, number 1, peat soda bottles, those are mostly turned into carpet and clothing. Some is turned into new, plastic bottles, but not as much. For your number 2 HDPE natural, like the milk jugs, those can often be turned into plastic furniture, or sometimes they're put into plastic drainage pipes that are used in infrastructure projects. And similarly, the number 2 colored, they're often turned into drainage pipes, or they might be turned into garbage containers. Because they're colored, there's less things that can be done with them. And so they're usually put into like a black product. So one thing that I want to touch on is this concept, this chasing arrows. This symbol is almost meaningless, but a lot of people assume that if it's on a plastic product, or I guess any product, that they assume it means it's recyclable. And that is not the case. So this is just a voluntary system. There's little to no regulation about who can place this on a plastic container. And the number simply indicates the main type of resin in the plastic. So as I said, there's number 1 plastics, number 2 plastics. That's really all the symbol means. It does not mean the item is recyclable. It might be a clue that it's recyclable, but it by no means indicates that it is recyclable. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that one. Do not take this as a gospel sign that something can be recycled. So there's a couple of different types of plastic that we help communities market. So some communities, they mix all of their plastics together. We call it a 1 through 7 mix. And this is about 25% of all the plastics that we help municipalities recycle in New Hampshire. So we have been working for years with one particular vendor who had a really good end market. And what that vendor did is they actually used primarily, they wanted the number 2 natural material, and they used that to make their own plastic lumber. And then they sent off the other material to other sources. Now, one of the issues with putting all of your plastics together, as we said, is when you mix commodities together, you tend to get a lower value than if they're separated. So in this case, municipalities get less revenue for their 1 through 7 mixed plastic. And I will give some pricing examples a little bit at the end. But it's also easier for residents. It's easier for transfer station staff. You don't need as many separate storage containers in order to do 1 through 7 plastic. But we ran into a problem where this great vendor had a major mechanical issue, and they needed a part from China, and it took months and months and months, and we had to scramble to find other options. So one thing we've been learning is that, there's not as many markets out there for 1 through 7 mixed plastic as we would like. So what is there a good market for? So there's actually plenty of options for a 3 through 7 mix. And this is what's typically coming out of a materials recovery facility. Materials recovery facility is typically going to take out the number 1 and 2 plastics, and we'll talk a bit more about those. But then they're going to send a 3 through 7 bale of plastic to a variety of companies that purposely then essentially do an additional sorting of the plastic. So for example, we recently started working with a vendor who takes a 3 through 7 mix. And what they're doing is they're taking out 2s, 4s, 5s, and 7s. Now you might say 2s, I said it's a 3 through 7 mix, but the issue is mainly when this material is coming out of a materials recovery facility, as I said, those facilities aren't perfect, and they're often missing number 1 and number 2 plastics. And so this company actually really wants the number 2s. That's primarily what they want. And there's a decent number of them hidden in these mixes. And then the residue, what they can't recycle, they are turning into a fuel replacement, and then they're landfilling some of it. But there's a lot of steady markets for 3 through 7, and it's something that we're going to be encouraging more municipalities to look into rather than a 1 through 7 mix. And then what a number of communities in New Hampshire do is they might only separate out their number 1 and 2 plastics. They might do their number 1 plastics, a separate container for their number 2 natural, and then they might have a third container for their number 2 colored. And all of these have very stable markets. And so there is more revenue in these than in most of the other plastics combined. but it does require 3 separate storage spots. And so, as I said, that, you know, it takes up space, it takes resident education. And then typically the rest are thrown away. We don't have a lot of communities who are doing a 3 through 7 mix right now. The number 5 plastic that I mentioned earlier, which you'd see in your yogurt containers, it does have value. However, for communities that source separate, they usually don't have enough volume for it to be worth it for them to separately store that material and then bale it and then market it. So I think we have one community we worked with in the last year that had several bales of just number 5 plastic. So we can find a market for it, but you're typically just not going to have enough volume to make it worthwhile for your community to separate that one out. And then there's another option. This is the last sort of plastic option I'll present, which is that some communities do what's called a Z bale. They'll separate out just their number 1 plastic bottles, and then they'll combine their number 2s. They'll combine the number 2 natural and the colored together into what we call a Z bale. Why it's called a Z bale, I do not know, but that's what we call it. And so if you look at this photo on the left, are bales of number 1 peat plastic, all of those water bottles. And on the right, we have some mixed bales where you've got both milk jugs and laundry detergent bottles, all of that mixed together. And again, for the Z bales, you're going to get a lower value than if you separated out the colored from the natural, but it saves space and it's easier for residents. So here is a snapshot of pricing, just to kind of put together, to bring together some of what we've been talking about. Now, some caveats to this. All of this pricing is just a snapshot for a moment in time. This is as of, oh, you know what? I'm pretty sure I updated this to April, but I wrote January, I left the January on it. So this actually is April pricing.
I was going to say.
I know I took the time to do that. So please disregard that discrepancy. But what this shows is a snapshot in time for April. And as I said, every month this changes. This is assuming that all the material is baled, so not loose, but baled, and shipped in full tractor trailer loads, because as we said, you get the best value when you ship in full tractor trailer loads. So those are some of the caveats with this information. But what I wanted to share is, you know, we've been talking quite a bit about how the more you separate out your material into individual components, the better value you can get. And so this gives you some really easy examples. So first, I want you to look at the plastics. Start now down near the bottom and look at the 1 through 7 plastic mix. You can see that right now, we can sell that for communities for anywhere between $0 and $60 a ton. But then as you march up the chart, you see that if you separate out just number 1 peat water bottles, you can get 140 to 220 a ton. If you separate, if you have your Z bales are going to be worth about as much as if you just have your number 2 HDP natural, your detergent bottles. They're between about 520 to 580 a ton. And then this is the one that I always find the most interesting, which is that way up at the top, way more valuable than anything else is your milk jugs. Those natural colored milk jugs. They are worth way more than any other commodity by weight. And keep in mind, of course, you have to have a lot of it, but by weight, they're worth so much more. And as I mentioned, that is because they have no color. And so they can be turned into a wide variety of things of different colors. Whereas all of your number 2 HDPE colored can usually just be made into black and gray things. And then similarly, you can see with paper, if you look way down at the bottom, mixed paper, all those different papers mixed together, you might get anywhere from paying $25 a ton to making $35 a ton. But as you march up the chart, you're going to see that sorted office paper has a higher value if you just pull out that. Cardboard has a higher value if you just pull it out. Newspaper. So this is kind of a nice way to demonstrate this concept that we've been talking quite a bit about. And now this is a good time for us to take some questions, and then we can also take a break. So let me scroll up a bit. I see that we had a couple questions come in.
So Reagan, while you're looking at questions, I just wanted to add one little
Absolutely.
piece about recycling plastics. I did speak to a business, a chocolate business, recently, and they make chocolate truffles. And the container, it's it's a plastic container and has that shiny background. And they said, well, it's recyclable, right? And in their minds, they're thinking their packaging was recyclable and that the plastic was recyclable. And the short answer is no. Your truffle packaging is going into the trash. And they said, well, there's a facility in Italy that can do that. So this is really talking about the difference between what could be recyclable, what there is, an idea of, or there's one place in the world that commodity can be accepted, and what is accepted in the US, what is accepted in the Northeast, what is accepted in New Hampshire markets today. So that's an example where the company is thinking, we're doing good, this is possible to be recycled. And in the reality, those candy wrappers are being thrown away. So that's just really the difference between the chasing the arrows and what is available for market. And the other thing is just talking about the number one plastics. There are a lot of communities, you'll see the number one on those plastic clamshells, but there are a lot of vendors that are not accepting. They're only wanting the bottles, but that depends on the vendor. But there are some vendors that do not accept clamshell, and it has to do with their processing. So it depends on the vendor of where the material is going, on what is required in the specs. So
yeah, that's a great point, because again, so many things can in theory be recycled. The question is, can they be recycled in your area? Is there a market in your area? Does your community produce enough volume to make it worthwhile to recycle it? I know that Stonyfield yogurt, I've heard the story that they allow their employees to do volunteer work. And so I think some of their employees had gone to the city of Keene and were really interested to learn about the dual stream sorting in the city of Keene. And they were horrified to see that their number 5 polypropylene yogurt containers were going in the trash. And they said, but this is recyclable. And Keene said, yes, it is, but we don't have enough storage space or volume to make it worthwhile to separately market it. So that's an important distinction. And on that note, there was a question here about, is there a market in this area for styrofoam? So the short answer is not really. I do know that there are some sort of national efforts to recycle styrofoam. It can be done, but in our area, we are not aware of any markets for styrofoam, unfortunately. There's another question that came in. Does NRRA help communities work between each other? For example, if Hooksett has scales, balers, gaylords, etc., can other towns that don't have these items leverage these, like rent them? Perhaps it's cost prohibitive. So what I'll first say is that the main way that we help communities work together, aside from just connecting them for information, is that we will do what I've mentioned earlier called milk runs, where if one community has half a load of a material and another community in the area-ish has half a load, we can arrange to have one truck picked up at both locations so that both of those communities can benefit from the higher price of a full truck. When it comes to actually helping communities sort of share material, there are actually a number of municipalities where one has a transfer station and then an adjacent town just uses that transfer station and maybe pays them for that value. So we have seen that. In terms of sort of renting equipment, that's a little trickier because typically if you have a scale, you're going to be using it pretty frequently. Or with a baler, for example, many communities might opt to have multiple balers. And so they can just keep loading material into it. And as soon as it's full, they compact it into a bale. And so they kind of use it as their storage as well. It's not something you can easily sort of move around. So there might be examples of that, but I'm not really aware of that so much. Just it gets a little complicated. Did you have something to add, Heather?
There are one or two communities that do that they're, kind to their neighbors, which is wonderful. But again, it really makes a difference. One baler in one community, they might bale, per hour. And another community might have a baler, but it's older or just takes longer time to really make that a dense bale, and then it'll take all day to make a bale. So the timing of when the balers are available for another person to use, another community to use, is tricky, but
Yep.
it happens, but occasionally.
Yep. And I will say, years ago, NRRA looked into whether we would purchase land and have a place for people to consolidate their material. We ultimately didn't go that route, but you know, consolidation definitely helps, and those types of partnerships can really help. It is somewhat tricky that we have so many municipalities in New Hampshire that are all kind of doing it on their own, and that's tough. Now, someone has a question. Many grocery stores accept used plastic bags for which they claim to be recycled. Do you know what the stores do with these bags? Yes, actually I do. So a number of these, I mean, I can't say every single store, but I know that a number of stores in New Hampshire, they are collecting those bags and then they're sending them to Trex, which makes them into plastic lumber for decking. So Trex decking, they actually use, I spoke with this company a while back to learn more about what they do. And they actually use, it's about 90% plastic bags and 10% sawdust. So that it has sort of that woodish type look to it, but they turn it into lumber. So the only issue that these grocery stores run into is that they really do need those plastic bags to be clean and dry. And so if someone, again, no one wants wet, stinky plastic bags for recycling, but yes, there is a market for those bags to be recycled, and sending them through those stores is your best option because very few municipalities collect those at their own facility.
And I would say every operator I've ever spoken to, they do not want plastic bags on their property. They are very happy that grocery stores and other stores collect those plastic bags because, number one, it serves as a contaminant in loads. You don't want it in your glass, in your paper, in your other plastics. It's a contaminant there. And then number two, really the number one is that plastic bags at a municipal transfer station, it's blown into the trees, it's blown all over the property, it becomes litter. So any well-intentioned person that is emptying their aluminum cans into one bin and then wants to do something with their plastic bag, they don't want plastic bags on the property. So it's a good thing that grocery stores do that.
Yep. And then we have a question about the 3 through 7 mix. The companies that resort that material, do they typically need loose plastics or compacted plastics accepted? So they are typically only accepting, they're only looking for compacted plastics, baled plastics, because typically these companies are taking the majority of their material from a single stream facility, and everything that's coming out of there is going to be baled and compressed. And so often they may not even be able to take loose material because their system is set up for them to accept a bale and feed it onto a conveyor belt and cut open the bale. So they're looking for compacted material. And then someone says, I believe LDPE are many containers generally soft or squeezable. How is that different from grocery bags in terms of recycling? So those soft and squeezable containers tend to not have much of a market for them. Again, they can be recycled. Is there a steady market for them? Not as much. Sometimes those types of soft and squeezable containers are more likely to, they sometimes might also have like 2 different types of plastic in them, but really those soft ones, usually the most recyclable items are like containers with a lid or a cap. But sort of these squeezable things, there's just not as much of a market for them. What is the difference among the various types of plastics that are made into bags?
You mean like grocery store bag, like reusable bags, or
like grocery bags?
I don't know.
I'm not quite clear on the question, but the different types of plastics that are made into bags. I mean, if we're talking plastic grocery bags,
the single use or the reusable, I guess, was the question.
Sorry, we're not really clear on that one, but if you wanted to, unmute and clarify.
Bill says grocery bags, garbage bags, reusable bags. So I guess he's asking what kind of plastics are made into garbage bags, I think.
Well, let's see. Let me go back to my list. Let's take a peek at that. So grocery bags are typically number 4 LDPE. So yeah, that would cover like your grocery bags or your trash bags. Let's see, another question. I've seen ads from a bottling group promoting a completely plastic drink bottle, including the caps. Do you know any more about this? The ads don't tell you how to participate. Well, I guess I'm a little confused because plastic drink bottles, the caps are usually also plastic. So I guess I feel like that's pretty common, although what I will say is that usually the plastic is a different type of, the cap is usually a different type of plastic than the bottle. The caps, I believe, are usually polypropylene, number 5.
Just to explain that wasn't meant to be plastic, it was meant to be recyclable. They're supposed to be 100% recyclable.
Oh, I see. Well, most plastic bottles, drink bottles are 100% recyclable, I would say. You know, most of them are that number 1 peat, and the caps are usually, I believe, number 5 polypropylene. And so they typically are 100% recyclable. So I guess I'm not really sure what they're trying to share with that ad exactly. Maybe,
Okay.
maybe they were saying that it was made from recyclable material. That might be it, because often they're made from virgin material.
I don't know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So these are all great questions. And what I will say is not seeing any more, I suggest we take our break. Ashley, we had talked about taking a 15-minute break, if that still makes sense, just for people to stretch their legs and not stare at a screen for a while. And then we can come back and cover a few more topics.
That sounds great.
Okay.
So let's see. So I guess we should invite people to come back at what time?
10:57 or something.
Why don't we just say 10:55 to make it easy?
Sure.
Let's all come back at 10:55. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
We got a break. Through the but it's delicious. Yeah, really good. You like it? Well, don't eat it. I'll eat it tomorrow.
All right, we're going to get started in one more minute. All right, Ashley, are we ready to get started again? I assume you maybe want to restart recording.
Yes, you are all set. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everybody. And I did see that we had one more question come in the chat during the break, which I'll try to address real quick, and then we're going to move on to composting food scraps. So the question is, what are the most common problems municipalities have that prohibit buyers to work with the city on waste reduction or recycling, besides the fact that it costs more? There's no space, expensive to sort, too far to ship, but what's the most common challenges? Heather, do you think there is one most common challenge? I think that's a tough one.
Well, a challenge from the municipalities' point of view is often storage. And I really think that, there are folks with lots of land, lots of, space. And I have seen small communities with small amounts of space be very efficient at that. Just really every corner is taken care of, and this moves here and this moves there. So I do hear storage as being a large concern from the municipality point of view. The buyer is willing to pay, it's just they need to store it up. So space, contamination, really having staffing, either having staffing levels, enough staff to prevent contamination in their material, to make it the highest quality for market, the highest price for market, or in addition with training residents on how to help them. So you don't have to have 7 people full-time, helping sort things and prevent contamination, but really using your residents to help you help them. So contamination and storage, I think, would be the 2 top.
All right, well, let's go ahead and jump into food scraps, composting food scraps. So composting food scraps is currently a pretty hot topic among many New Hampshire municipalities. We get a lot of requests about this. And there was actually a question that was submitted in advance of the workshop that said, what are the opportunities and barriers to municipal food waste diversion and composting? And that is exactly what we're going to talk about in this section. So in New Hampshire, remember that about 13% of all the waste that is generated nationwide is leaf and yard waste. And fortunately, many municipalities in New Hampshire, they're composting this material on site. Sometimes they're burning it or sending it elsewhere. And that's because in New Hampshire, we do have a ban on landfilling or incinerating leaf and yard waste, which is great. So that really brings us on to food scraps, which is the one we get a lot of questions about. And I will say that I use the term food scraps. I try to use the term food scraps instead of food waste, because there's been some research that shows that talking about food waste might be more of a turnoff to residents, because you're implying that they're wasting stuff, but everyone has scraps. Everyone knows that they have food scraps. So I do try to use the term food scraps. And so food scraps, as we discussed, are the single largest landfill of material being landfilled from residential waste. That's not true of everything being landfilled, but from residential waste, we're talking about 24% by weight of all the residential waste that's being landfilled nationwide. And yet we also know from the Environmental Protection Agency that only about 4% of those food scraps in the US are being composted. And there are a variety of problems with composting food scraps. There's environmental problems because they are a powerful generator of greenhouse gases when they They don't compost in a landfill. They very slowly decompose without oxygen. There's financial problems with composting food scraps because, as we've talked about, you're paying by the weight, and food scraps are very heavy because they're wet. So they're expensive for a community to be throwing away. And then there's also moral reasons and problems with landfilling food scraps. And here's a food recovery hierarchy chart from the Environmental Protection Agency. And they are encouraging people to reduce food waste. And then any food scraps should be used to feed hungry people or to feed animals. There are industrial uses. And composting is really only the next best thing before landfill or incineration. So I did want to point out that even though we're talking about composting here, it really should not be our first choice for managing food scraps. Now we have another poll. We wanted to get a sense of which of your communities are composting food scraps. Does your municipality offer food scrap composting to residents, whether it's on site at your transfer station or if you're offering it through a service? So for example, there are communities on the seacoast that use Mr. Fox composting to pick up their material. So we'll go ahead and launch a poll to just get a sense of where you all are. Are you composting on site? Are you composting through a service? Are you not doing it? Are you thinking about it? Maybe you're having some conversations. And what I will say is that most municipalities are not doing anything with their food scraps. And as I see the results rolling in, I can see that, right, most people are not doing anything with their food scraps, but we'll give it another moment or two for a few more people to respond. All right, why don't we go ahead and close that out? And let's see, can everybody see that? So what we have is that about 2/3 are not doing anything with their food scraps. And then we've got some who are composting on site or through a service, and then a few who are thinking about it. And that's about what I expected. So, you know, most municipalities are not composting their food scraps at this point. So what we do see in New Hampshire is that we do have limited food scrap composting. We've got 6 active food waste, food scrap composting facilities in New Hampshire. Only 2 of those are composting meat and dairy. And that is because we have some, our composting regulations really need to be updated in New Hampshire, and that is in progress. Other states are really devoting more resources for education and outreach and grant programs and legislation that encourage or mandate food scrap composting, more so than we have in New Hampshire. So for example, in Vermont, they now have mandatory food scrap diversion for all residential food scraps. And some other states have bans for certain commercial generators of food scraps. Now in New Hampshire, if you want to compost food scraps in New Hampshire without including meat or dairy, then if your facility has what's called a permit by notification, you need to reach out to the Department of Environmental Services and notify them that you wish to start composting on site. If you wish to compost food scraps and include meat and dairy, currently that requires a pretty extensive and expensive permit process with the Department of Environmental Services. There was a law that was passed back in 2015 directing DES to establish updated rules about composting meat and dairy that would make it more doable for a community that has a permit by notification to compost meat and dairy, but that hasn't been completed yet, although they do allow communities to reach out and request a waiver of those rules, but they're working on it. And so that is you know, one of the reasons why we don't see as much food scrap composting. And this distinction between meat and dairy is important because it's just much more convenient for residents to put all of their food scraps together instead of being asked to separate out the meat and dairy. And the reason why our rules and regulations currently don't provide these best practices for composting with meat and dairy is because it does require a heightened level of attention to properly compost meat and dairy, because you have to have higher temperatures for a longer period of time, but it can be done and it can be done well, but we don't have those updated regulations right now. So if you want to think about starting a municipal food scrap program, here's some of our suggestions. One is to first launch a backyard composting campaign to encourage residents to compost on their own. And part of the reason is you want to get residents into the habit of even thinking about separating out food scraps. So a number of municipalities do this time of year. They'll be getting compost bins and either selling them or giving them away to their residents. We actually offer a compost bin sale that I think is closing today. Today was our deadline, but municipalities can get compost bins through us. And it's just a great way to get your residents reducing the waste that's being thrown away, which saves money for your municipality. Next, you would need to check your permit, see what kind of permit type you have, talk to DES, reach out to them. You may have to update your permit. You may need to update your operating plan for your facility. And then we definitely encourage you to get educated. Talk to another community who's doing this, and we'll give you some examples. And maybe have your staff take a course so that they are really up to speed on best practices for composting. And then you also want to identify what you're going to do with your material after you've generated it. Where's it going to go? Are you going to give it away to residents? Are you going to use it in your town? And then we also encourage you to start small. As Mark Morgan of Lebanon explained, he recommends you walk before you run. If you start with a small pilot project, you can do some course correction and train your staff and residents before you go bigger. And we think that's great advice. So in Hollis, New Hampshire, they are composting food scraps on site without meat or dairy. All of their staff, not all of their staff, I mean, several of their staff attended the Maine Compost School, which is a great school that is available to learn about composting on a large scale. And they have a permit by notification. So they reached out to DES, gave them notice that they were planning on starting this, and then they were able to get started. And they report that they fill about 3 trash cans full daily when their facility is open with food scraps. And this has been pretty popular among their residents. And then in Lebanon, New Hampshire is a little different because they have one of the limited service area landfills in the state. So they actually take material from over 20 communities, and they decided they wanted to start reducing the amount of material that was being landfilled as food scraps. So they first started with a very aggressive backyard composting campaign to educate their residents. They did a pilot project last year. And what was interesting is through this pilot project, they were able to sort of fine tune the process. And some of their participants noticeably decreased the amount of food scraps they were bringing in during the pilot, simply because they were separating out their food scraps and seeing how much they generated. And then they changed their practices in terms of buying and cooking. And so that was kind of neat. And they estimate that about 20% of the total disposal weight going to Lebanon's landfill is from food scraps. So that's, it's about in line with that about 24% nationwide number that we saw. And in 2020, during their pilot project, they diverted 3,000 tons of food scraps, which is pretty impressive. Now, their current program, they've expanded it, and this year they have over 135 residents who are paying $15 each for an annual permit. That's what they roughly estimated it cost them to do this. They also have commercial accounts that are bringing in food scraps. And those commercial accounts, like a hospital, for example, they can pay $50 a ton for their food scraps versus paying $75 a ton for their, to dispose of that as trash. So there is cost savings for them. But any compostable products coming in, Lebanon requires that it be what's called the BPI certified. And a main thing that certifies is that there's no PFAS, which is one of those sort of forever chemicals that is you don't want in your compost. And they do require that the compost be bagged in biodegradable bags. They're diverting now about 400 pounds monthly. And really their limiting factor for expanding further is that they need a lot of carbon. They need a ton of leaves in order to properly compost all these food scraps. So they're working on getting more and more of that type of material to their facility. And what they do is they actually use their compost as daily cover on their landfill. And then it's also used in the city, on city properties like cemeteries and parks and athletic fields. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we also have some communities who are able to use a commercial system. So for example, on the seacoast, communities can use Mr. Fox composting. So Lee and Rye, New Hampshire, are two members of ours who are using Mr. Fox composting. And if you want to do this, it would require an update to your operating plan. But since the material is not being composted at your facility, it's a pretty simple update. So in this case, Mr. Fox picks up material from bins that are at the transfer stations at these facilities. And they can include meat and dairy because all of it is being taken back to Maine and composted in Maine according to Maine's regulations. And so Rye, for example, they fill up 4 50-gallon trash bins weekly of bagged food scraps from their residents. And it helps save them money off of the cost of disposal. And then we have some resources that I included in here. We actually have an overview of the composting laws and regulations in New Hampshire on our website. This is actually a hyperlink. So I think this was sent to you all maybe as a small PDF. So I'm not sure if the hyperlinks will work, but we could get these to you. We also have a food waste diversion webinar that I did maybe a year or so. And then just a link to the Maine Compost School. So if anybody has any questions about food scraps, let's see. I did see we had a comment from Deborah saying that my town has on-site service, but use and compliance is low, looking to improve this. Okay, so it sounds like you might have a service like Lee and Rye do for Mr. Fox. I don't know, Deborah, if you wanted to share a little bit more about some of the compliance issues you're running into that we could talk about.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi there. So yeah, so my town is Portsmouth, and we do use Mr. Fox, the municipality, but a lot of contamination issues, and many of the residents don't even know it's available for use. It was a pilot project a number of years ago. It's not a pilot anymore, but not heavily used.
It sounds like public education would be needed to give food scraps an ad.
Yeah, and so Chris is on a team with me who's also on this, and we purchased your bins, your kitchen, your countertop bins or whatever.
Pails, yep, the compost.
Yeah, the pails
scrap
to
pails.
Use in advertising, education, promotion kind of thing.
Oh, good. Well, I hope that helps, right? I mean, that's one of the challenges with rolling something like this out, is just getting people aware of it and encouraging it and making sure that they've got clear messaging on it, because it can be hard for people to change their habits, but once they get into the swing of it, they can actually, people tend to be pretty excited about it. Not everyone, of course. And I wonder, perhaps it would be worth reaching out to Mark Morgan in Lebanon, just to, because they are a larger facility, and maybe see if he has any thoughts about how they've sort of messaged this to their members. I do know, I believe it was NHPR did a nice story about Lebanon's pilot program a while back that got a fair amount of attention. So maybe even sharing sort of another success story with your residents might be helpful. But Mark,
that's great. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, and that's really a lot of what we encourage, is reaching out to folks who have done it themselves, and they can be a really good resource for you.
And Mark will be speaking at our conference as well. So
oh, that's true. Yes, yes, yeah. Thanks for the question, Deborah. And then I see Bill says, is the agricultural community interested in getting food scraps from municipalities? As a matter of fact, some are. So I do know that we are actually working on developing a resource on our website that would list different companies and farms that do want food scraps. So for example, Lewis Farm in Concord, they're interested in taking food scraps from municipalities. And so we're working right now on a resource that we would be able to put together and share with all of our members that would provide information like that. Because that's another great option is, you know, farms are set up already to do large scale composting in many cases. They've got the space.
And at a different level, there are lots of examples of individual schools. You might have an elementary school that has a food scrap, you know, collection program from their cafeteria, because in school cafeterias that the weight of food scraps can double. It can be over 50% of the material they're producing at schools. You have paper, you have cans, but by weight, it's mostly food scraps. And so I know a number of examples of individual schools that are partnering, you know, with the small farmers with chickens and making that loop there. And then the students are really excited because they know they have incentive not to contaminate the food scraps because they're going to go feed the chickens, and they can kind of see the end result of that.
All right, well, with that, let's go ahead and move on to talking about pay as you throw, which is another way to help reduce the waste that your community is disposing.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a major diversion tool. PAYT, pay as you throw. Municipalities charge residents to drop off construction debris, tires, etc. Why not do the same with waste? For the New Hampshire Municipal Association 2015 article, 41% of Massachusetts communities use PAYT and 32% in Maine. The majority of towns in Vermont use PAYT due to the Act 148. And as of 2015, 26% of New Hampshire communities use PAYT. And in New Hampshire, a little over half of that are bag programs, and 27% are sticker / tag / punch card programs, and 15% are in overthrow programs. So an overthrow program is an example of the residents' municipal solid waste fees covers anything they can fit into a certain size cart or bin, and they have to pay extra to dispose of anything that does not fit into the cart. So then this fits all size communities is the positive of pay as you throw. All right, want to take a quick poll. Does your community use a pay as you throw system for handling trash? Yes, no, or thinking about it? I'm seeing as the results come in that a majority at this point do not use pay-as-you-throw systems. And a few are thinking about it, and a few are yes. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. So 3/4 do not use pay-as-you-throw, and a few are thinking about it, and a few are doing it. All right. So the pay-as-you-throw is a unit-based fee system. So if you no more have mandatory recycling, you could choose to throw everything away with pay-as-you-throw bag or with a sticker or punch card. But most residents realize the direct cost of throwing away and opt to recycle as much as possible to avoid the cost. It's similar to a utility bill, and the one who uses a great amount of electricity pays, for this per kilowatt, and the one who conserves electricity pays less. And both pay for what they use in the unit-based fee system. The benefits, they provide residents incentives to throw away less, and they encourage residents to use the valuable resources more responsibly and increase recycling and other waste diversion methods. It reduces MSW generated and saves money for municipalities. And individuals, New Hampshire really feel like they have control over their costs of their own waste, and they're not responsible for other people's wastefulness. The criticisms of pay-as-you-throw is the added cost disproportionately affects those with fixed or lower incomes. because if you can afford to throw everything away, you have the right to. The concerns about illegal dumping, if the fee is too high, increasing illegal dumping on back roads, and trying to identify the sweet spot for bag price. I know some communities that instituted a bag price, but it was 15 years ago. So clearly costs have increased. So wanting to pass that cost on to residents, but not to dissuade them from using the system. And they don't want to be too low to encourage reduction of waste, but not so high to encourage illegal dumping. So here's an example from Shelburne's website. They adopted a pay-as-you-throw. It means their garbage must be disposed of in special bags, which may be purchased at a transfer station or the town office. And the cost of the package of 5 bags is $7.50. And they switched recently from single stream to source separated. And here's an example of Shelburne. They wisely cover their material to keep out the weight of rain and snow in New Hampshire, ultimately producing a better product to ship to market. So that lid is key with the straps. An example of a medium-sized city is in Littleton. From their website, they're paid by the bag system. It's required to buy the Littleton town bags to dispose of your household trash at the facility. The cost of the bag covers disposal, hauling, and other costs associated with their facility. Remember, there's no cost for most of everyday recyclable items like paper, glass, cans, bottles, or cardboard. So for 20-gallon bags, they're $2 each, so $20 per roll, and 30-gallon bags are $3 each, or $30 per roll. And Littleton has their, Littleton Recycles DU. And then our example of our large size city is from Concord. And residents have strong incentive to decrease their waste with this program by reducing, reusing, and recycling. Unit-based pricing systems such as PAYT have been proven to reduce trash volumes. Trash tonnage has reduced by 40% in Concord since PAYT program began in 2009. So that's an example, it fits all different size communities that they could do that. So we want to ensure in compliance. How does New London ensure compliance? They give the person an explanation of how to get the sticker, allow them to dump that one time to drop off their material. Then they turn them away in the future unless they have a sticker. So I kind of give them one shot. And then they're consistent, and they support from the town administrator and town clerk is essential. So you really need that relationship between your staff operators and town administrators to back them up. That makes for a happy system. In Lisbon, how they ensure compliance, if the resident brings trash not using a PAYT bag, the staff charge them for a PAYT bag. If a large black construction debris bag, or they could charge double, or the resident can weigh the bag on the scale. So that's just kind of how they divvy it. It's just, we're going to give 2 times or weigh it. Well, how do you get started with pay-as-you-throw? Here's a sample warrant article. If you're interested in pursuing PAYT, there are plenty of examples available to replicate to get process moving. One community who's currently pay-as-you-throw said it takes at least a year to discuss, educate, and then vote in town meeting, which is usually middle of winter. So getting started there. And then here are a bunch of resources we have on pay-as-you-throw on our website. We have several info sheets on pay-as-you-throw, on plastic bag sources, and then one on cutting your trash in half, how New Hampshire towns and cities can secure their financial future with pay-as-you-throw that we have on our website. Any questions about pay-as-you-throw? Let's see. I've seen the public pushback and hesitancy towards pay-as-you-throw. How have successful municipalities begun the conversation and public messaging without the immediate pushback? That's a very good question. Reagan, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, what I would say is I'd encourage you to hear it firsthand. We're actually at our conference, we're having Dennis Patno, who is the former transfer station manager for Lancaster, New Hampshire. He's going to be talking about pay-as-you-throw, and they started it as a conversation about, does it need to go to a town vote? Yes, pay-as-you-throw does typically need to go to a town vote, is my understanding.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, Dennis has a great story about how they had the conversation with the community and made it very clear that they only wanted to cover the costs of disposal, so that, you know, the town knew that those costs would be covered, and that they would only make the bags charged just enough to cover the cost of disposal, no more. And they have not raised the cost of their bags in, I think, the decades since they started their program. So by being very clear that there wasn't an expectation that there would be this sort of money grab to use this for other sources, they were able to actually get some really good community support there. So, you know, again, as I was saying before, reaching out to other communities who have done this is a great way to get started. We have that list on our website that indicates the other communities with pay-as-you-throw New Hampshire. And, you know, especially speaking with someone like Dennis Patno in Lancaster and hearing him at our conference, reaching out to someone like that would be a great option.
Yeah, I mean, numbers talk, and Dennis has numbers to prove it, and he'll be using those numbers at the conference for sure. Yes, it does need to go to town vote is the question. And is it always going to save the town money, isn't it? Most people are convinced by that. I believe all the examples we've had have ended up saving the town money. It just, you know, it comes from a different perspective. It's changing from the idea that, well, is recycling, you know, how do you incentivize it? And then how do you mandate it? But the mandate for recycling is removed when you go through pay-as-you-throw. So it becomes a weight issue. And then so it's really a mind shift of what people are doing with their waste, and you know, whether they are trying to avoiding the weight through disposing of less. So I do believe so. It says we had pay-as-you-throw in Tilton. We then went to curbside single stream with minimal drop in recycling tonnage. Paying for bags was very unpopular, right? People don't like the idea of there being a cost to that. I think Dennis would be able to speak better to laying out all the numbers. You know, the residents see that cost of the bag up front, but then you're looking at the disposal fees and other fees as well associated that are not as upfront to the residents, so the hidden costs. Any other questions on pay-as-you-throw? Okay, let's move on to full cost accounting.
All right, this is going to be the last topic we cover today, and it kind of ties together quite a bit about what we've been discussing. But it's this idea that we really should understand the true costs of our trash and recycling programs, our solid waste programs. Now, to start with a myth, you know, we'll often hear that if you can't sell your recyclables for a profit, then you should just throw them away. But the truth is that recycling and other waste diversion methods like composting can be a really valuable cost avoidance strategy for communities. And so when we're talking about cost avoidance, we're talking about, you know, comparing all of the revenue against all of the avoided disposal costs from your recycling and from your other waste reduction techniques. And what we might actually find is that in many cases, helping a community lower their expenses can be more impactful than helping a community increase their revenue, especially when it comes to solid waste programs. So a specific example of that would be that a number of communities will pay $40 a ton to recycle their glass because there's not a great market for glass, as we discussed. But paying $40 a ton is still quite a bit less expensive than paying $85 per ton to throw it away, if that's what your community is paying for disposal. So it's important to think not just about, are you making money, but also what costs are you avoiding by the actions that you're taking to reduce your waste. So if you want to get a good sense of what the full cost accounting is for your community, you really need to start with what are your disposal costs. And this may seem rather obvious, but we know of communities where perhaps the transfer station staff don't have this information. They might not know where their trash is going. They might not know what they're paying for disposal. So, for here, we would just say to focus on two main things to start with, which is, what is your tipping fee? What is the cost that you're paying to send your material by ton to a landfill or incinerator? And then also, what is your transportation cost? Because that's really important as well. And when you have those two pieces of information, you really can understand your total cost per ton. And we do encourage you to do this on a per ton basis to the extent you can, because again, that's really how we're measuring revenue and costs for recycling and solid waste. So for example, your community might have a $75 per ton tip fee to take material and actually tip it into the landfill or incinerator. And then you might be paying $25 a ton for transportation. So that means that your cost that you're trying to avoid in all other instances is that $100 per ton of disposal cost. Now, the next step would be to determine your recycling revenue or cost. Now, if you're a single or dual stream community, this might be pretty straightforward. You might know pretty easily what is your tip fee. Again, you'll probably have a tip fee to take your material to a materials recovery facility. Isn't just fibers and containers. There's so much more if you have at your transfer station. You're taking construction and demolition debris, which we'll talk a bit about, various other materials. So, with an example of cardboard, let's say that you're getting for your baled cardboard $80 per ton of revenue. You don't want to forget about what is the cost that you're avoiding. So remember that in my prior example, you're avoiding $100 per ton of cost because you didn't have to pay $100 to throw away that cardboard. So really you can look at it as sort of having this intrinsic value. The cardboard actually has this value of $180 a ton because you're avoiding that cost, that higher cost of disposal. And if you're breaking down, if you're a source separated community and you're breaking down your revenue and costs for recycling, we would encourage you to start with fibers because, as we've talked about, fibers tend to be more than half of your residential stream. And so by weight, that is the bulk of the material that you're going to be managing. And here's an important one, is that it's really valuable to analyze your facility fees that you collect from residents. So it's pretty common to collect a fee from residents for construction and demolition debris, tires, trash if you use pay as you throw. And it's really valuable to compare those to compare those fees for each individual item to the costs that you are incurring. And you really want to know if your fees cover your costs. And again, this might seem kind of obvious, but when you take the time to run the numbers, there's some surprising things you can find out. So here's a great example. Guilford, New Hampshire charges a fee for their construction and demolition debris, as do, I think, most communities. And they use their data to find that over the course of a year, they had only covered, by taking in those fees, they had only covered 55% of the costs of what they were paying to dispose of that construction and demolition debris. And this is big money because communities usually move quite a bit of construction and demolition debris, and it tends to be quite expensive. So what they found is that this was costing their town nearly $40,000 a year beyond what they were receiving in the fees coming from residents. And the idea was these fees were supposed to cover the cost of disposal. So why did they have this problem? They had this problem because they didn't have a scale, and it was very difficult for their staff to estimate accurately how much material was being brought in. They're looking in the back of the truck, They're trying to estimate how much material's in there. They tended to err on a smaller amount, and they weren't charging a high enough fee for this material. And so what they did is the town was able to actually use, the public works director was able to use this information to get town approval recently to purchase a truck scale for the facility. And over a number of years, this truck scale is going to be paid off by the fact that they're going to be able to charge the right amount of fee for all of this material coming in. So this is a really, $40,000 is real money. And then, another step that we encourage is making sure that you track your monthly expenses and revenue. So all of this can be extremely helpful with planning and budgeting. So for example, if you've got your monthly data, when you look at, how often are you sending out your municipal solid waste? How often are you sending to market your recyclables? If you look at this on a monthly basis, you can start to see trends. And if you add in your staffing costs, such as salary and benefits, you really get a better picture of what your program is costing or making you. So for example, in Littleton, New Hampshire, by doing this type of monthly tracking, they know that February every year is going to be their lowest month for revenue, and they can plan accordingly. In Guilford, they know that cardboard is the main commodity that rises pretty notably in terms of what's coming into their facility over the summer months. Other than that, they're fairly stable throughout the year. And this really can help them for that future planning. And then also, when you have that type of monthly data, it enables you to look for trends. And then you can really start to do some fine tuning. So you can identify ways to slightly increase your revenue or to slightly decrease your expenses. So for example, Littleton, New Hampshire, they have their staff pick out metal from the construction and demolition pile during downtime. And then they can recycle that metal for a revenue and reduce their cost of what they're sending out as construction demolition debris, because that material is often getting landfilled. Sometimes it gets recycled. We do have a vendor we work with to recycle construction demolition debris, but often it's going to a landfill or incinerator. And so by making these types of small adjustments, you can decrease disposal costs by increasing revenue. And then I wanted to take some time to share sort of the value of resident education and to provide a few examples where communities have gotten creative to help explain this cost avoidance concept to their residents in a pretty straightforward way. Because, everybody can glaze over with numbers, but if you can just get across this concept that, recycling or composting or these other things are going to help save taxpayer money, that can really be compelling to some people. So for example, in the town of Lee, they market their material, much of their material through us. And we issue to our members a monthly pricing guide. That sort of snapshot I showed you of all the different pricing, we have sort of a really detailed version of that we give out on a monthly basis. And what Lee, New Hampshire has done is they have used that information to provide signs for their residents in their transfer station. So for example, here with their aluminum cans, they've got a little sign that says aluminum cans, 42 cents a pound of revenue. And then over where people dispose of their trash, they've got a sign that says, $67 a ton is, our cost of disposal. So it really clearly shows to people, oh, an aluminum can makes the town money. Throwing away my trash costs money. It's just a nice way to keep residents informed. And then another example is, to the extent if your community uses social media, Guilford, New Hampshire actually has a very active social media presence. They use Facebook quite a bit for their public works department. And what's interesting is they've found that their posts about recycling are among some of their most popular posts. So this is an example of some photos that they shared that provided details about how the town was selling 19,000 pounds of aluminum through NRRA, and explaining where that aluminum was going, and congratulating the residents for doing such a great job with recycling, and really just helping people understand that recycling can bring revenue to your town in this situation. And as I've said, those have been quite popular. And then here's a really simple one that I love. And this is something that comes from Hollis, New Hampshire. Now, they had a situation where they noticed that people were throwing scrap metal into the hopper, basically into the trash. And scrap metal is a good source of revenue for communities. And so what they did is they put together this little cage, pulled a bunch of items out of the trash that they had seen thrown away, put the scrap metal here near, I think it was near the exit actually to the facility, and then just wrote this little sign, and it says, please don't throw away scrap metal. Revenue for 2018 was $22,000, $22,507.96. And they got so much attention from this one little sign. So many residents asked about it, and people would come by and show them something and say, so does this go in the scrap metal pile? I mean, people just didn't know. And so even just some simple signage and transparency can be helpful for people. And then lastly, there are also signs that you can use. So every community in New Hampshire gets a certain number of points each year from New Hampshire the Beautiful, which is a food and beverage group that encourages recycling. And these points can be used to acquire signs. And so here is one of the signs related to recycling that a community can get. And I have seen this up at a number of communities. And again, it's just a simple way that you can fill this out and let your residents know what income you receive from recyclables, what costs you're avoiding, and any notes that you might want to add. And I'll say that one of our staff at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association, she said that well before she worked at our organization, she lived in Peterborough. And Peterborough had one of these signs up. And so at the time, she didn't know anything about the financial benefits of recycling, but she saw this sign. She saw that recycling saved the town money. And so she personally made a point to step up her recycling game at home. So this does seem to be kind of an underutilized resource, but just even some signage can go a long way to help residents understand this concept. And then we do a webinar we did a while back last summer called Tricks of the Trade. And Brian Patno, formerly of Littleton and now up in Lancaster, he shared some great information about full cost accounting. And I will say that the Department of Environmental Services is hoping to eventually do an in-person, in-depth full cost accounting class where municipalities can actually bring in their data ahead of, with them to class. And then we would sit down in person and actually walk through how to generate some spreadsheets to understand this information. So hopefully that will come out once we're able to meet again in person. So does anybody have any questions about sort of this full cost accounting concept? Is it possible to get a paper copy of this PowerPoint? I imagine that Ashley, maybe we can email out to everybody a version of the PowerPoint that's a sort of PDF of the full slides. I believe you sent around a handout version before.
Yes, so everybody did receive in the same email that they received this Zoom link, they should have received the PowerPoint PDF attached to it. However, at the end of the workshop, I will be sending the recording, the evaluation, the certificate of attendance, and the PowerPoint again, which I will be mentioning later at the end of the session. So I'll just leave it at that for now, but yes, you'll get a copy.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, not seeing any other questions coming at this point, then we will start wrapping up. And so, where do we go from here with all this information we've learned? If we had to sum it up, our advice for communities, if you have a single or dual stream program, resident education to help clean up your recycling stream is pretty key if you want to help contain your costs. As we said, I'm sure those dual and single stream programs, you've seen your costs rising for recycling. For source separated communities, consider to what extent you can separate out more material, recognizing, as we said, that there's various factors there in terms of space and staffing. For everyone, we really do encourage your residents at the very least to compost, because if residents are composting at home, it's going to save you money. It's going to help set you up for the future if you want to start doing sort of a food scrap composting program. And especially in light of sort of all the big changes we've seen in recycling markets, we just encourage communities to avoid making dramatic changes. Especially when we were in the earlier days of China's national sword. You did hear about some communities that just stopped recycling because they had really high costs all of a sudden for their recycling programs. But it changes over time, and fortunately we are in more of an upswing in the market, and I think some more stabilization. And then sort of on a more individual note, how can you as an individual help address some of the changes we talked about today? So there's a lot of value in knowing and understanding where your waste and recyclables go. Just to be able to tell a resident which landfill your facility uses for its trash, or if it's using the wheelabrator incinerator. And then you can also use that information to help educate others about waste management and recycling, and just make sure that accurate information is being shared. Certainly encouraging the local use of crushed glass, processed glass aggregate, that will help ensure that we can continue to sort of offer that as an option for municipalities to recycle their glass, because there are just such limited options. And it is a great product. And if we can't be recycling this all into new glass bottles and jars, it's a great alternative that uses the material locally. And then this is one that, we don't always talk a lot about, but again, for recycling to work, we really need to have products with recycled content. We need to be buying things that have recycled material in it. So both as an individual level, but also communities, if you are looking at your purchasing practices, perhaps you can make sure that you're buying certain materials that have a bit of recycled content in them. Paper is a very easy one, printing paper. It's very easy to buy affordable printing paper that has recycled content in it. And last one, as we've talked about, composting food scraps. If you can do it at home, that's a great option. Or if you can find a local farm or service, it's a great way to help reduce waste. And then if you want to learn more about these topics, I did want to share that we have a free email newsletter that we send out every other week called Full of Scrap. It's something that's available to sign up for on our website. And we also have a really extensive resource library on our website that has, I think at this point, dozens of recorded webinars, and many of the things that we shared with the hyperlinks, different documents and things that are free and available for you to share with others.
And that resource library just got bigger today.
Yes, we just added a bunch of new items to it. That's true, in honor of Earth Day. And then, as we mentioned, we do have our conference coming up in May in just a few weeks. And as I said before, over 80% of municipalities in New Hampshire are members of NRRA. And this year, because we're doing it as a virtual conference and because we have generous sponsors, we're able to offer the conference for free for all of our members. So I would say most of your municipalities probably could attend for free. And that includes both your solid waste operators and select board members and recycling committee members. We really, welcome communities to have folks attend. We'll be talking about engaging residents with recycling. We'll be talking about waste reduction through pay-as-you-throw and reuse programs, as well as composting. We will have a national expert, an expert in epidemiology who will be talking with us about safely handling trash and recycling during the pandemic. We'll be talking about more in depth about national, local recycling markets and recent changes. We'll be spending a whole hour on plastics because people have so many questions about plastics recycling. And then last one, which I think will be really fun, when we're going to have several of our vendors talking about what actually happens with your recyclables. What happens with glass? What happens with paper? Those types of things. And then the last plug I wanted to put out there is that the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services is having a workshop in June that I'm doing along with Bonnie Bethune, one of our other member services staff at NRRA. And this is going to be a 3-hour in-depth discussion about recycling markets and practical recycling tips. And this is free for all solid waste operators in New Hampshire. So if you found this useful today and you'd like to have some more of your town staff, your recycling staff, learn more about this, this would be a great option to have them attend this free event. And with that, we are ready to take any more questions that might come through. And I will say that we had one other question that came in beforehand that I don't know if we have fully answered it. So I thought it might be good to cover this one now, which is when we say that recycling is worth it, how do we include the externalities that come with landfills in the conversation? There's more involved than tipping fees from a long-term sustainability perspective. So in that regard, I would say that if you think of a tractor trailer going down the road, if it's filled with trash, this is sort of on a one-way street. It's going to a landfill or an incinerator, and it's going to take up space forever. But if you fill that trailer with cardboard or plastic or aluminum cans, that material is being made into new products, and that requires that we don't have to cut more trees or extract more oil or mine more ore. So, if we're buying these products and using their contents and then recycling the material, that is always going to be a better bet than landfilling or incinerating that material. So any other questions? Well, then I would say thank you all very much. It was great to be with you today and some awesome questions. It's always really fun to answer the questions. So
Thank you.
thanks for joining us.
Yes, and I would just like to say thank you to Reagan and Heather for sharing their expertise with us today, and to thank you, our members, again for attending this workshop. And I just want to let you all know and make you aware that no later than tomorrow morning, I will be sending out the evaluation, a certificate of attendance, as well as a copy of the recording. And with that, I thank you again, everybody, presenters and attendees, for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.